So that's a really interesting change, isn't it?
Huge.
Yeah, and do you think what do you think within that new change and that new framework? Obviously, should it come into fruition, what are the main barriers to development then now that you see, and what techniques do you and your team see to overcome them?
Well, in the sort of transport and movement world, the main barriers are probably are the capacities in the transport network that surround us and how we can incrementally improve it. And there's always a position where a proposal comes along and essentially it's the straw that breaks the camel's back.
Yeah.
Or is it? Is it the thing that causes the change that makes everything else work? And that's where we are. Yeah. We're at the solutions end of actually, let's turn this over and look at it differently. That's where we're going.
The straw that breaks it, the solution
the thing
to the
that
problem.
helps it unwind and work better. And we've seen what the best outcome could be in terms of travel, because people reacted very differently during the pandemic. They worked at home. They changed the way that they work. A lot of the people that are watching this might be working at home. Well, 10 years ago, we didn't do that. We didn't do it in any great volume.
Yeah.
Now we are doing that. And what that means is there's a bit of headroom opening up. We can use our infrastructure better. And that's what our processes, our assessments, the support that we give to processes and for applications, that's what it gives us.
Because as you say that, you see the peak traffic changing.
Well, if you boil into some of the more analytical end of the stuff that we do, and we pour over the spreadsheets of data and the big data that we now have, the trillions of records of mobile phones that move around the networks, we can see the way that those sort of peaks have moved in the network. We can see them, what we call peak spreading. We can see that happening. We can also see people changing modes. And we can also see the impact of people not travelling at all. And that was one of the key tenets of what was PPG 13, which followed the white paper, going back a long time in my career now. It was one of the three things: reduce the need to travel.
Yeah. I think the pandemic's been really interesting in that way.
Well, it's told us that big things can happen that aren't to do with transport, that make a massive difference to transport. Yeah. And that's one of the possible outcomes that are out there. It's a scenario that we ought to test, is what if there's another big technology change that means travel sort of levels of traffic decrease.
Yeah, and it's like that when we talk about air quality to our air quality consultants, and we talk about decarbonising, and we talk about going to battery vehicles. So your emissions all of a sudden, and then you've got the same problem, I guess, in some traffic design for car parks, that EVs are much heavier. Well, and it brings in loads of mode changes and things that you wouldn't have expected.
There's lots of subtle changes there. So, an electric car is still a car. Yeah. You have to have it on a piece of road space. You have to park it in a parking space. So a lot of things don't change. Parking loading
parking spaces could do with getting bigger.
Parking spaces could do with getting bigger. That's a particular hobby horse of mine, but we'll not do that. But there are changes there. But EVs are, to my mind, electric cars are a transitional stage in personal transport. Coming down the line very quickly are hydrogen vehicles, and they're out there on the road today already. Yeah, that's right. And they've got different impacts on the network. They're still clean, they're still emission-free, but they produce water. Yeah. Well, what do we do with that water landing on the highway? Is our highway drainage ready to cope with that? Well, the answer in some cases is no, because it doesn't really cope at the moment.
I think it's really interesting. It leads me a little bit into another point where clients often ask us, like, why should I use transport modelling, or what benefit does transport modelling give me? And just as a question, how do we currently use transport modelling, and what's the benefit that it gives us?
Well, first of all, it's very interesting that people ask, what am I going to get from transport modelling? Because in a lot of cases, the answer is not a lot. A transport model might, if you crank the handle on a big transport model, it might tell you it's very busy today and it's going to be very busy tomorrow. Well, what does that actually tell you? Well, not a lot. So we use a whole variety of techniques, from a very high level assessment, sort of red, amber, green. What happens if you change X mode to Y mode? More people cycling, more people walking, more people on buses. Well, how does the shape of that scheme change if you do that? That's a different sort of transport modelling. You can boil it down to the sort of big assignment modelling, and we were looking at some last week where we've got a very high level strategic model, and it basically tells us how the levels of service change at a high level, but that's all. You then need to boil it down and focus in on something. So when we're working on a scheme for a client that perhaps needs highway access sorting out, so we end up with a big signalised junction, we would use a different set of techniques, a different set of transport models to work out how to make those things work most efficiently. If we want to put bus priority through it, so buses activate the signals and they go green all the way, different piece of software to do that, different model. That's where the value lies, is in pulling out sort of techniques and results of models that actually tell us something, that help us advance that proposal and prove that it works. So we win hearts and minds, and obviously communicating the results of that model and what it's telling us is the hard bit. And that's where we're really good at Zygo.
That's
telling people what it means.
Yeah, because people look at whether it's in traffic or in flooding or in landscape, taking something technical, and as you say, boiling it down to the point that the person on the street understands. My other question to you, because you and I are often involved in a lot of planning appeals, should our clients be worried about appeal? And do we think it's going to increase under the new NPPF framework? I
don't think anybody should be worried about the planning appeal system. I think it's an opportunity that's there for a reason. And the reason it's there is if you have a turbulent ride through the planning process, and you have a good proposal, a good case, and for one reason or another it's not accepted at a local level, you can then go in front of an impartial person who will have all of the facts presented to them, and they will balance all of the various aspects up and make a decision. And that's a good thing, because it then places you in a position where you're able to explain your case. And you're able to give that evidence, and you're able to tell them and communicate and to win those hearts and minds, this is why what we are coming forward with stacks up. So from that perspective, I don't think appeals are anything to be afraid of at all. The one thing I would say is that if you go to appeal, you have to go to win. And that means you've got to have a strong case, and you need to make that case. You have to communicate it well, and you need to put all the cost and resource that's required to make the best outcome.
I totally agree with that.
And to a certain extent, there is a lot of uncertainty in there, and you can never walk away from that. But doing the best that you can at an appeal to get the best outcome is the best that you can do. And again, that's what we do at Zygo.
And we have been very successful in a number of appeals. One question that I always ask for some of our students or people at school that watch some of our vodcasts is what advice would you give to somebody who wants a career in transport engineering?
That's a very interesting question, because when I look back to my daughters and my stepsons, none of them have any interest in being a transport planner or a civil engineer, of which I'm both. And the advice that I would give to someone who really is interested in it is it's a broad church, and there's a lot in the work that we do. We plan for people, we plan for how you move goods, we plan for how you move vehicles. And there's a wide variety of sort of facets of that are of interest. It's not as pure as the other engineering disciplines, it's not as limited, but it is incredibly interesting. So running on from that, the key thing for me when I see someone coming into our organisation is to give them a little bit broader experience, so they understand the context of what they're doing and how it fits in, because they'll be a far better transport planner, flood modeler, whatever it might be, as a result of that, because they understand how all the bits of the jigsaw fit together. And the final thing is making sure that you're getting good mentoring and good experience and picking up the right sort of technical training, let's call it. Because if you've got all the tools in your toolbox, you'll learn to use them.
I think that's really key. I think the mentoring part, especially for younger people, is really key. That's really good. Thank you very much for listening to our podcast this afternoon. It was interesting with Tony taking us through transport planning, and what we got to listen to is the way that sometimes we're putting the information across has got to be very clear and make it understandable for people. Also, one interesting part for me is when we talked about the point where we have increasing development, the straw breaks the camel's back, the different way that Tony and his team are looking at this now to say, well, maybe it's not that creates the problem and breaks the back, it maybe gives you the solution. I think that vision way of looking at things, which Tony was saying supported in the NPPF, is a really good step forward. I also think what's really key is making sure that you've got the right team and the right people to take these things forward. And as we talked, you don't necessarily have to be afraid of going to things like plan and appeal, but you have to go to win, and you have to go with a really strong case. Thank you very much for listening. Please do follow Zygo on all of our social media channels. That's LinkedIn, YouTube, Instagram, and X. Thank you very much for listening.